Philosophically, this moment confronts the avoidant with something deeply uncomfortable, the idea that autonomy without connection becomes isolation over time. Independence feels powerful when it's chosen. It feels empty when it becomes habitual. The new year forces that distinction into awareness. It asks, without words, are you free or are you just protected? And that question destabilizes identity. Avoidants often define themselves by self-sufficiency. I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. But when a year ends and another begins, self-sufficiency is no longer a shield. It becomes a mirror. It reflects not just strength, but what was sacrificed to maintain that strength. Emotional depth, shared growth, being truly known. This is where many avoidants feel an internal contradiction they can't articulate. On the surface, nothing is wrong. Life may be stable, even successful, but internally, something feels unfinished, incomplete. The new year doesn't create that feeling. It reveals it. It strips away the story they've been telling themselves and leaves behind the truth their nervous system already knows. And here's the critical insight most people miss. This discomfort is not punishment. It's an invitation. The new year isn't attacking the avoidant. It's confronting them. It's offering a moment of clarity that rarely appears during the rest of the year. A moment where emotional avoidance no longer works the way it used to. Because you can't outrun time, you can't rationalize your way out of meaning, and you can't reset a year without also resetting awareness. The new year doesn't force change, but it makes self-deception impossible. And once that illusion breaks, the real work begins. Once the illusion of endless time begins to crack, something else follows almost immediately. An awareness the avoidant can't negotiate with. Time is no longer abstract, it becomes personal. And this is where the new year delivers a second, deeper trigger, regret that cannot be rationalized away. Avoidants are exceptionally skilled at explaining things to themselves. They don't deny emotions outright, they reinterpret them. What might feel like loss becomes necessity. What might feel like longing becomes logic. What might feel like fear becomes standards. This cognitive reframing protects them from emotional overwhelm, but it collapses when time enters the equation. Because time does not argue, time does not justify, time only accumulates. When the year changes, the avoidant is forced to see duration instead of moments. They don't just remember a relationship ending, they see how long it's been gone. They don't just recall distancing themselves, they see how often it's happened. Patterns become undeniable. And for someone who relies on compartmentalization, this is deeply unsettling. Regret for the avoidant doesn't arrive as sadness, it arrives as tension, as an internal pressure that has no obvious outlet. They may feel irritable for no reason, disconnected from goals that once motivated them, suddenly bored with achievements that used to validate their independence. What they're feeling isn't weakness, it's the weight of time highlighting emotional costs. There's a philosophical truth here that hits avoidance especially hard. Every choice becomes meaningful when repeated long enough. Avoidants often believe they are choosing freedom in each individual moment, and maybe they are. But the new year reveals the sum total of those choices. It shows WS what that freedom has added up to, and sometimes what it has subtracted. This is where regret becomes unavoidable. Not because they did something wrong, but because something was never done at all. Love delayed, conversations avoided, vulnerability postponed indefinitely. These aren't dramatic regrets, they're quiet ones, the kind that sit beneath consciousness and drain vitality over time. What makes this especially difficult is that avoidance can't fix regret with logic. You can't reason your way out of time lost. You can't intellectualize an experience you never had. And the new year brings this realization into sharp focus. Opportunities don't disappear suddenly. They fade gradually until one day you notice how long it's been. This is why the new year often triggers thoughts of the one that got away. Not necessarily the most intense relationship, but the one that required presence, the one that asked them to stay instead of retreat. That person becomes symbolic, not because they were perfect, but because they represented a path not taken. And the mind returns there because time has made that choice irreversible. Avoidants often try to neutralize this feeling by doubling down on productivity or self-improvement, new goals, new routines, new distractions. But underneath that movement is a subtle urgency, a recognition that time is no longer neutral, it's directional. And once that awareness sets in, the nervous system reacts. Psychologically, this creates a mismatch, TCH, between identity and reality. The avoidant sees themselves as someone in control of emotions, of timing, of outcomes. But time introduces a variable they cannot manage. It moves forward whether they engage or not. And this loss of control is what makes the new year so destabilizing. It exposes the limits of self-sufficiency. There's also something existential happening here. The new year doesn't just mark another cycle. It marks finitude. It reminds the avoidant that life is not a draft. That connection delayed is not the same as connection chosen later. That some doors don't slam shut. They quietly close while you're standing safely on the other side. This realization can feel heavy, but it's also clarifying. Regret, when fully felt, is not meant to punish. It's meant to recalibrate values. It shows where energy was withheld, where fear disguised itself as preference, where emotional safety was prioritized over emotional truth. And this is the turning point, because once the avoidant recognizes that time cannot be paused or negotiated, they face a choice: continue protecting themselves from discomfort or begin protecting themselves from emptiness. The new year doesn't accuse, it doesn't demand, it simply reveals. And when time becomes visible, so does the truth you can no longer talk yourself out of. As time becomes more visible and regret starts to surface, another force amplifies everything the avoidant has been trying not to feel: contrast. The new year doesn't just mark personal reflection, it's a collective reset. And in that shared moment, loneliness hits harder, sharper, and far more honestly than at any other point in the year. Loneliness is not simply the absence of people, it's the awareness of separation. And during the new year, that awareness intensifies because the world around the avoidant is moving toward connection. Families gather, friends reconnect. People speak openly about intentions, growth, and togetherness. Even the language of the season emphasizes closeness. New beginnings, shared goals, rebuilding bonds. For the avoidant, this collective movement acts like a mirror they didn't ask for. What makes this especially destabilizing is that avoidants often don't experience loneliness the way others do. They don't feel an immediate ache. They feel a dull dissonance, a sense of being out of sync with the emotional rhythm of the world. They may scroll through images of celebration and feel nothing, or feel something they can't name. But beneath that surface neutrality is comparison, not with others' lives, but with what could be present in their own. The new year removes plausible deniability. It becomes harder to say, I don't need anyone, when everyone else seems to be anchoring themselves to someone or something meaningful. Independence, which once felt empowering, starts to feel isolating when it stands alone against the backdrop of shared experience. And this isn't jealousy, it's existential awareness, psychological. Why? Humans are wired for belonging. Avoidants are no exception. The difference is that avoidants learned early on that closeness came with a cost. So they built identities around autonomy, competence, and emotional containment. These strategies work until the environment changes. And the new year changes the environment dramatically. When the social world resets, routines dissolve, distractions weaken, and the avoidant becomes more aware of absence, not of chaos, but of warmth, not of drama, but of intimacy. They don't miss intensity, they miss consistency. Someone who knows their rhythms, someone who notices their silence. And that realization can be deeply unsettling because it contradicts the story they've been telling themselves. This is why loneliness during the new year feels different. It's not about being alone, it's about being separate, watching others move forward together while standing still emotionally. And that separation creates a subtle grief, not for a specific person necessarily, but for a version of life that includes shared meaning, philosophically. This moment challenges the avoidance belief system. If independence was the ultimate value, why does it feel hollow when reflected against connection? If self-reliance is strength, why does it feel heavier when no one else is present to witness it? These questions don't demand answers, but they disrupt certainty, and disruption is where growth begins. Avoidants often respond to this discomfort by minimizing it. This is temporary. I prefer being alone. People are overrated. But loneliness doesn't argue. It persists quietly. It shows up as fatigue, as a lack of enthusiasm, as a sense that achievements don't land the way they used to. And during the new year, when hope and connection are everywhere, that absence becomes impossible to ignore. What's important to understand is that this loneliness is not a failure of independence. It's evidence of humanity. It's the nervous system signaling that safety alone is not enough, that fulfillment requires presence, mutuality, and emotional risk. And the new year amplifies this signal because it strips away excuses. It doesn't ask the avoidant to change. It simply asks them to feel, and feeling for the avoidant is the hardest part. Yet within this loneliness lies something powerful. It clarifies desire. It reveals what truly matters beneath layers of self-protection. It shows that autonomy without connection eventually turns into emotional isolation. Not because independence is wrong, but because it was never meant to exist alone. This moment can either harden the avoidant further or soften them just enough to reconsider their path. And that choice doesn't come from pressure. It comes from awareness, from recognizing that loneliness is not the enemy. Disconnection is. The new year doesn't make the avoidant lonely. It makes loneliness visible. And once you can see it clearly, you can no longer pretend it isn't asking something of yo. When loneliness becomes visible, it creates space. And space, especially emotional space, has a way of pulling unfinished things back into awareness. This is where the new year triggers something many avoidants find deeply confusing: old emotional bonds resurfacing with a force they didn't expect. Avoidants often believe they've moved on when in reality they've compartmentalized. They don't process emotional endings the way securely attached people do. Instead of integrating loss, they file it away. They close the door, turn off the light, and tell themselves it's handled. Most of the year, that strategy works because life stays loud enough to keep those doors shut. But the new year is quieter, and quiet has a way of reopening rooms that were never truly cleared out. This is why avoidants are often caught off guard by sudden thoughts of someone from the past. Not just any ex, but a very specific person, the one who required emotional presence, the one who saw through their independence and asked for something real. These memories don't return randomly. They return because the nervous system is finally calm enough to feel what was never fully felt psychologically. Unresolved attachment doesn't disappear. It goes dormant. And dormancy is not resolution. When external stimulation drops, the mind naturally returns to unfinished emotional loops. The new year creates exactly this condition: fewer distractions, more introspection, and an implicit sense of what now, what makes this especially uncomfortable for avoidance is that these emotional bonds resurface without drama. There's no crisis, no breakup happening in real time, just a quiet remembering, a sudden curiosity about how someone is doing, a lingering sense of I wonder. And because avoidants rely on emotional distance to feel safe, this resurgence feels intrusive, even threatening. They may question it. Why am I thinking about this now? I was fine before. But the truth is, they were functional, not finished. The new year removes the urgency to perform and reveals what still carries emotional charge. Philosophically, this moment confronts the avoidant with the reality that meaning is not linear. We don't simply outgrow emotional connections by moving forward. Some bonds imprint us because they represent something essential: safety, authenticity, or the possibility of being known. And when those bonds are left unresolved, they don't fade with time, they wait. This is why avoidants often feel a strange mix of nostalgia and resistance during the new year. Nostalgia for the closeness they experience, resistance to the vulnerability it required. These two forces collide internally, creating emotional tension that has no clear outlet. They don't necessarily want the person back, but they can't fully let go of what that connection symbolized, and that symbolism matters. Often the person who resurfaces in the avoidant's mind represents a version of themselves they never fully lived into, a self that was softer, more open, less defended. The grief isn't just about the relationship, it's about the self that never got to exist fully within it. This is also why avoidants may suddenly feel tempted to reach out during the new year. Not impulsively, but reflectively. Not from desperation, but from recognition. The passage of time has stripped away surface conflicts and left only the core question: what did this connection mean to me? But even when they don't reach out, the emotional impact remains. The resurfacing of old bonds destabilizes the belief that emotional distance equals closure. It reveals a deeper truth, that closure comes from integration, not avoidance. And integration requires feeling what was once suppressed. This can be unsettling, but it's also a rare opportunity. The new year doesn't resurrect these bonds to torture the avoidant. It brings them back to highlight unfinished emotional business, to show where fear interrupted growth, to point toward what still holds meaning beneath layers of self-protection. And here's the paradox: the more an avoidant tries to push these memories away, the louder they become, Because unresolved attachment doesn't ask for attention, it demands understanding. The new year isn't asking the avoidant to relive the past, it's asking them to finally make sense of it. And until that meaning is integrated, the past will keep knocking, quietly, persistently, and right on time. When old emotional bonds resurface, they don't just bring memories, they challenge identity. And this is where the new year triggers one of the most destabilizing experiences for the avoidant, an internal conflict between freedom and fulfillment. Avoidants organize their lives around autonomy. Independence isn't just a preference, it's a survival strategy. At some point early on, they learned that relying on others came with disappointment, intrusion, or emotional cost. So they built a life that minimizes dependency and maximizes control. And for a long time, that life works. It feels clean, efficient, safe. But the new year introduces a question that autonomy alone cannot answer. Is this life actually fulfilling? This isn't a dramatic collapse. It's a quiet erosion. Goals that once felt meaningful start to feel repetitive. Success still registers, but it doesn't resonate. Achievements land intellectually, not emotionally. And that distinction matters because fulfillment isn't about what you accomplish, it's about what you share. The avoidant often confuses freedom with absence of obligation. No one to answer to, no one to accommodate, no emotional negotiations. On the surface, this feels powerful, but over time, freedom without connection loses its depth. It becomes hollow, not painful, but flat. And the new year amplifies that flatness by contrasting it with collective purpose and shared meaning. Psychologically, humans derive identity through reflection. We understand who we are through how we're experienced by others. Avoidants limit this reflection intentionally. It protects them from vulnerability, but it also limits emotional richness. When the new year invites evaluation of identity, the avoidant is forced to confront a difficult realization. Autonomy has protected them from pain, but it has also protected them from intimacy. This is where the identity crisis emerges, not because something is wrong, but because something is missing. Philosophically, freedom without attachment creates a self that is unchallenged, comfortable but untested. Growth, however, requires friction. It requires being seen, misunderstood, negotiated with, and emotionally impacted. The new year highlights this truth by asking not just what did you achieve, but who did you become while achieving it? And this is where avoidants feel trapped between two narratives. One says, I chose independence because it makes me strong. The other whispers, I'm lonely because I never let anyone close enough to matter. These narratives don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And the tension between them creates emotional fatigue. This fatigue often shows up as restlessness, a desire for change without clarity about what needs to change. Avoidants may think they need a new goal, a new environment, a new version of themselves. But what they're actually craving is integration, the ability to hold autonomy and connection at the same time. The new year exposes the false dichotomy avoidants have been living under, that closeness equals loss of self. In reality, fulfillment comes from choosing connection, not surrendering to it, from allowing intimacy to expand identity rather than erase it. But that understanding requires emotional risk, and risk is exactly what avoidance was designed to prevent. Still, the discomfort grows because fulfillment cannot be achieved alone forever. At some point, the nervous system recognizes that safety without stimulation leads to stagnation. That being untouched emotionally is not the same as being at peace, and the new year makes this recognition unavoidable. This moment doesn't mean the avoidant regrets their independence. It means they're being asked to redefine it, to move from isolation disguised as freedom to autonomy that includes emotional connection. To recognize that the highest form of independence is not self-protection, but self-expression in relationship. And this is where the crisis becomes an opportunity. Because once the avoidant sees that fulfillment and freedom don't have to be enemies. Something shifts. The question is no longer, do I give up my independence? It becomes, what kind of connection allows me to remain myself? The new year doesn't demand an answer. It demands honesty. And when freedom is no longer used to avoid closeness, it finally becomes what it was meant to be, chosen, not defended. When freedom and fulfillment collide, the avoidant reaches a crossroads. Everything leading up to this moment, the reflection, The awareness of time, the loneliness, the resurfacing of old bonds, the identity conflict has been quietly building toward a decision. And this is where the new year becomes unavoidable. Not as a date on the calendar, but as a psychological threshold. For the avoidant, this threshold presents two paths. One feels familiar and safe. The other feels uncertain and destabilizing. And the difference between them is not circumstance. It's courage. Some avoidants respond to this moment by reinforcing their defenses. They interpret discomfort as danger. They tell themselves the feelings will pass, that vulnerability is unnecessary, that independence is still the smartest choice. They become more controlled, more detached, more emotionally efficient. On the surface, life continues to function, but internally something calcifies. Emotional flexibility decreases. Curiosity shuts down. What once felt like protection slowly becomes confinement. This is the breakdown path, not dramatic, not visible, cumulative. It shows up as chronic emotional numbness, as a sense of living next to life instead of inside it, as relationships that never deepen, not because opportunity is absent, but because access is denied. Over time, avoidance stops being a strategy and becomes an identity. And identities once hardened are difficult to dismantle. But there is another response, quieter, less certain, far more powerful. Some avoidants experience this moment as an awakening, not because they suddenly become comfortable with vulnerability, but because they recognize the cost of perpetual avoidance. They begin to see that emotional safety purchased through distance carries interest, and that interest is paid in meaning, connection, and aliveness. This awakening doesn't come with dramatic resolutions. It comes with small, unsettling questions. What if I stayed instead of pulling away? What if I allowed discomfort without escaping it? What if closeness isn't the threat I think it is? These questions don't demand immediate action, but they shift orientation, and orientation determines trajectory. Psychologically, this is the moment where avoidance loosens its grip, not because fear disappears, but because fear is no longer the only voice in the room. Curiosity enters, self-compassion enters. The possibility that growth might require exposure, not protection, begins to feel real. Philosophically, this is where the avoidant confronts a fundamental truth. Safety and growth are not the same thing. Safety preserves what is. Growth expands what could be. And a life optimized solely for safety eventually becomes smaller than the person living it. The new year amplifies this realization because it frames life as directional. You are not standing still. You are moving forward whether you choose to engage or not. And when time is no longer abstract, inaction becomes a decision. Avoidance becomes a choice with consequences. This is where responsibility emerges, not responsibility to others, but responsibility to the self, to the parts of the self that were silenced to maintain control, to the emotional capacities that were underdeveloped because they felt dangerous. The avoidant begins to see that vulnerability is not the absence of strength, but the willingness to remain open when strength alone is insufficient. The breakthrough path is not about becoming emotionally exposed overnight. It's about tolerating closeness in increments, allowing connection to exist without immediately escaping it, staying present through discomfort long enough for the nervous system to learn that intimacy does not equal annihilation. This is slow work, uncomfortable work, but it is transformative. And here's the critical distinction. Breakdown is passive. Breakthrough is intentional. One happens by default. The other requires choice. The new year doesn't force either. It simply makes the difference visible. For the avoidant, this is the moment where patterns either repeat or dissolve, where emotional walls either thicken or begin to soften. And while fear will always be part of the process, it no longer has to be the architect of their life. The new year doesn't ask avoidants to change who they are. It asks them to stop hiding from who they could become, and the direction they choose here doesn't just shape the year ahead, it defines the depth of every connection that follows. As this year turns and another begins, what's being revealed isn't just a pattern of behavior, it's a pattern of protection. Avoidant attachment was never about coldness or lack of care. It was about survival, about learning how to stay safe when closeness once felt uncertain, overwhelming, or costly. And for a long time, that strategy worked. But the new year does something no defense can fully block. It creates perspective. It's how's you time passing, choices repeating, connections unfinished. It strips away momentum and asks a single uncomfortable question: is this way of living still serving you? What this moment exposes is not failure, it's limitation. Independence without intimacy eventually becomes isolation. Control without connection becomes emptiness. Safety without vulnerability becomes stagnation. And the ache you may feel at the start of the year isn't weakness, it's awareness finally catching up to truth. This is the crossroads. You can repeat what you've always done and feel what you've always felt, or you can allow this moment to recalibrate you, not by forcing change, but by telling yourself the truth, by recognizing that emotional walls don't just keep pain out, they keep meaning out too. The new year doesn't demand that you open up to everyone. It doesn't ask you to abandon your strength. It asks you to stop confusing distance with freedom, because real freedom isn't the absence of attachment, it's the ability to choose connection without fear running your life. And if you let this moment do what it's meant to do, not distract you, not pressure you, but clarify you, this year doesn't have to be a repetition of the last. It can be the year you stop avoiding what you actually want.